Okay, I think in the interest of time, we should start. As usual, we would like to begin by recognizing and acknowledging that we are on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Weah, Miami, Muscatine, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois bears a particular responsibility to acknowledge the indigenous peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have enabled the growth of this university over the past 150 years. While this acknowledgement cannot heal the wounds, we are called to reflect on and actively engage with these histories, recognizing the role this institution has played in shaping them. Centering Native peoples in our work is a necessary first step as we look forward to the next 150 years. Well, tonight we are delighted to welcome James Binning as part of our fall lecture series, Critical Practice. I'll say a few words about the theme. Critical practice invites reflection on the evolving role of designers as critical agents in shaping equitable, resilient, and culturally grounded futures. In the face of today's social and environmental urgencies, the series explores how designers think, make, and act within and beyond the built environment. Contributing practitioners and educators working across architecture, landscape, and urbanism activate design as a tool for critique, transformation, and care. Together, these voices actively reshape what it means to practice today. And now I'll say a few things about our speaker, James Binning. James is a founding member of Assemble, the design-led interdisciplinary collective that in 2015 became the first architecture practice to win the Turner Prize, Europe's most prestigious art award, for their Granby 4 Streets project in Liverpool. Working alongside a resilient local community, Assemble helped reimagine a post-industrial neighborhood in decline, setting a benchmark for socially engaged design practice. Within Assemble, James has contributed to a wide range of projects, from the design and fabrication of furniture and installations to the orchestration of large-scale collective builds and the design of public spaces in the UK and abroad. Since 2014, James has also taught in architecture schools in the United Kingdom and abroad, including at the London Metropolitan University School of Art, Architecture and Design and the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne in Switzerland. His teaching emphasizes collaboration with local authorities and community organizations, exploring alternative approaches to the lack of affordable housing, enable self-build at scale, promoting community-led development, and pursuing equitable and ecological building practices in both urban and rural contexts. This pedagogical work has informed and expanded the strategic dimensions of his professional practice. James is currently engaged in projects across the United Kingdom, France, and Australia, from developing new models of self-built, community-led housing to designing a new theater with a local organization in France, and leading a large project in Australia that integrates spaces for industry with cultural, civic, and commercial uses. I also would like to say just a few things about Assemble in general. Since its founding in 2010, Assemble has built a diverse portfolio spanning temporary theaters, artist studios, community housing strategies, and new public squares. The collective has evolved into a pioneering studio that fosters community engagement and sustainable networks of collaboration, skill sharing, and craftsmanship, while challenging conventional notions of authorship and process. Whether transforming an abandoned petrol station into a cinema, as in the Cinerolium, their first project, created without a client or budget, or revitalizing neighborhoods through resident-led restoration, as in Granby 4 Streets, Assemble consistently demonstrates how design can serve as a tool for cultural enrichment and social empowerment. I will end with an anecdote. In May 2022, I took my then 6-year-old daughter to the Place We Imagine exhibition at Nottingham Contemporary, where the gallery had been transformed into a playground through play structures co-created by school children and assemble. As we stepped inside, a giant green ball barreled past us, pursued by a giggling gang of children. Far from a don't touch, don't get near kind of exhibit, the space erupted with the joyful chaos of children running wild, their laughter and shrieks filling the space. This scene, in my mind, perfectly captures Assemble's vision of architecture as a holistic collective space, defined not only by physical form, but by the social and creative activities it fosters. In short, James Binning is exceptionally well positioned to address the theme of our lecture series, Critical Practice. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming James Binning.
Okay, got the green lights. Can you hear me okay at the back? Yeah, great. Okay, thanks. So the talk I'm going to give today is quite wide-ranging, I think, and really tries to think about our work, but also the structures that really enabled and shaped that work, and how, as those structures have changed, so our work has changed, and perhaps we're in a moment of reflection, I think, in our practical organizing in relation to the work that we do, in kind of actively trying to rethink maybe some of the structures that we've adopted and kind of work within. And yeah, so really I've called this talk Practice Architecture. In the UK, it's quite common to talk about, you know, the organization that you work within as an architecture practice, which suggests a level of kind of active engagement with, I guess, the tools and methods that you're constantly using to develop work. And, you know, I think also being here in America today, I thought I'd start the talk with a kind of David Foster Wallace quote, which I think really sort of sums up like something that took me quite a while, I think, to understand in my own practice. This quote about two young fish swimming along, and they meet an older fish. He asks them, "How's the water?" And they swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" And, you know, as a young architect, you know, when we graduated, I graduated in 2009, and then we sort of started Assemble as a slightly sort of confused and quite spontaneous idea, really in response to being quite inspired by other people of our generation who were taking a kind of attitude of, if we learn these things in school, how do we apply them as quickly as possible on the city and the world around us? You know, really we didn't have a good sense of all of the ways in which architecture as we'd learned it in the school environment was really fundamentally shaped by all these other external factors, you know, kind of all the kind of policies and regulations of construction, of planning, but also how money, you know, really shapes who decides what happens, who benefits in the long term, in the short term. And I think really our practice has been one of figuring out all of the ways in which architecture actually is a very small role, or has in some ways quite limited agency in the built environment, and trying to think about how we organize to leverage what agency we do have. And so, you know, I guess my experience of kind of graduating into the architecture profession was to sort of exist somewhere near the bottom of this pyramid of relatively conventional practice. And not every office is organized like this, but most are. As you can see, lots of workers and graduates and interns at the bottom. And gradually, as things go forward, that pyramid tapers and people step out for all kinds of reasons. Some of them to do with you know, relatively low pay in a challenging sector, especially as in the UK and the US, you're often encumbered with quite a lot of debt when you leave. People pursue other prospects, but there are also reasons, you know, people have families, have children, take time out. It's a very difficult industry to get back into. And I think within this, you know, we've sort of found that the idealism that we were kind of infused with in our education about being young architects that could go out in the world and do some good, you know, exercise some civic responsibility with the tools that we'd been equipped with, quickly ran up against this structure that didn't give us a lot of agency at all, and also really revealed some very obvious limitations in our education in terms of our basic understanding of how the world is built, both the forces that shape it, but just practically, like how to build. And within this, then, we were quite interested in, well, actually, it would be a bit revisionist to say we were quite interested in. I guess by coming together to do a project in our free time as a way of sort of figuring out a shared confusion about really what it meant to be a young architect and what the profession of architecture was about, a group of people that I studied with, there were around 20 of us, came together to work on a project. And that wasn't about forming a company or having some clear idea of how we were going to do something that would lead to other things. It wasn't starting a business or even an association. It was really about forming a group of people that did this first project with a budget of around $5,000. So we all put in a bit of cash, about £100 each, and then we won a small competition which gave us about £3,000 as well. And within that, kind of using reclaimed materials and basically a reclaimed structure, a leftover piece of petrol station, automobile infrastructure in the middle of the city, kind of transformed this space over a period of 6 weeks as an open construction site where we then programmed films and things. And this was kind of actually like the site plan as a model of how the practice was also organized. Kind of in each corner of the site, you had a small group of people working with some degree of autonomy and a very loose shared idea about what this project was going to come together as. It was going to have a big curtain, a big sign, and some flip-up seats, the things you need in very crude terms to have a cinema. And a year later, after we'd sold some cinema tickets, quite a lot of beer and ice cream, raised about £15,000 from that first £5,000 spend, we put that back into another project using another available site, in this case a motorway undercroft, and used a lot of reclaimed materials, processed them into these timber bricks that were kind of strung together, so a kind of totally dry construction. Again, really working weekends and evenings in a way that was quite, or as much about recreating a kind of workshop culture and a spirit of experimentation and practical hands-on making as anything else. It was about activating this space or sort of making use of this space that was quite closed off from the city and making it more public. And at this sort of point, we start to organize more formally. You've done 2 projects together, and we start to think about, okay, well, so-and-so's done more hours than this person. Like, should people start being paid if there are inequities in how much time people are putting into the project? Should we do more projects? Is the idea that this is a kind of amateur association? At this point, we've done 2. People were starting to get interested in commissioning us to do work. Is that something that we were open to? And so we moved from this kind of chaotic organization on the building site as the primary way in which we work things out in quite an anarchic form in many ways to something more structured and deliberative, and that really moves from building on the one hand to sort of policy making and practice building on the other. And you can see still quite a lot of people involved. And at that point, that is something called Assemble. It starts to become kind of, it has articles. You can look us up on the government's website and figure out that we actually have a registered address and all this kind of formal stuff. And that formal form of organizing enabled us to move from doing those kind of self-directed, really, and self-funded and very lean, economically speaking, initial projects to something that starts and is capable of taking on more public work. So our first project was the redesign of a quite simple and quite dull, in some ways, town square in an outer London suburb called New Addington, which had quite a lot of antisocial issues in relation to this public space. And the project was very, very simple, but we tried to take a lot of the methods and tools that we'd used on those early projects, and I guess an interest in the way that by constructing things in space, we were able to open up different kinds of conversation about the future of a petrol station that's empty or a motorway undercroft in ways that drawings alone wouldn't have allowed. And we took a similar method in this project, reconstructing or constructing temporary stages and walls that kind of redefine the edges of this space and kind of gave a prominence to, in this case, a sort of stage area around 2 trees in this square, and used that instead of drawings as the way of having a public discussion about the future of the space and what available budget should be invested. And that resulted in a few very small but pragmatic interventions dealing with actually the stage covers one soak away, so basically a big water drain for the square, and in the other one we cut it back and turned it into a sort of stepped ramp and seat, and then change some of the things around the edges that affect how traffic flows. I'm not going to talk about any of the projects particularly in kind of great design detail, but to sort of explain how the sort of transformation of the practice as an organization and the sort of transition of certain ideas and principles that we try to use in early projects follow through into later ones. And so in this town square project, yeah, an idea of the kind of directness and immediacy of physical construction, enabling a wider public to engage with our ideas in a way that drawings alone, and like the typical tools of architecture projects in public contexts, wouldn't have. And at that point, you know, we move from being this kind of big group of 20 people into a slightly differently organized group that has a kind of core of people who chose not to go back and study, and a wider kind of group of people that are associated who went back to continue their education. And really during this period, the work that we focused on doing was, I think, interested in the extension of what we saw as kind of productive infrastructure to a more kind of public audience. And we're working in these kinds of projects with still, conventionally speaking, very small budgets. This was done for about $100,000. The transformation really of this industrial shed into a public access workspace. So really as much interest in the kind of uses and activities and culture we're supporting through making cheap space available for businesses to come in that might have been being pushed out of an area by housing redevelopment, as we are in the formal changes and the kind of visual language of the buildings themselves, which are usually driven by an interest in economy. So this is the sort of level of fit out of the interior of that space. On the one hand, a kind of public cafe, on the other, very simple kind of workbenches and things. The idea of this as a kind of public library for access to tools and knowledge about making. And at the same time, these other projects that are almost kind of anti-material in some ways, like in a similar way to that previous project, there's a focus really on getting a lease on a building and securing a site for a kind of 5 or 10 year period on the basis that there is a sort of, you know, we are as interested in what happens in the city culturally as we are in its kind of physical form and materially, like how it's kind of composed. And so this project was about taking the resources available for a sculptural commission in Glasgow that would have celebrated the kind of Commonwealth Games, and thinking instead how we make a sculptural object to commemorate really what was quite a destructive process where an area of the city was substantially demolished, and instead take a lease on a piece of land in that area and say, well, how do we start to reconstruct this land much more quickly amidst a landscape of demolition that is going to be in flux for 10 years. So again, working with, in this case, around £100,000 again for the duration of this project, we started off by acknowledging that all of the children's play spaces in this neighborhood had been demolished as part of the Commonwealth Games master plan. And none of them were going to be replaced for the next 5 years at least. And as a consequence of all of that demolition, many children from this area were starting to break into construction sites. So children as young as 6 or 7, in quite a poor part of Glasgow, break into construction sites to sort of play because they're kind of amazing environments. In some ways, they're quite like, you know, you may have seen these extraordinary images of children playing in kind of bombed out parts of Europe in the wake of the Second World War. And so the first move of the project, once we'd sort of secured a lease on the piece of land, was to just divert spare construction materials onto this site, chippings, pieces of kind of large drainage piping that weren't needed, and to kind of create a loosely held space in which children could come and play in a much safer environment, but one that was still very loose and kind of undetermined and very kind of capable of being made and remade. So again, less interest really in this as a formally designed space, and interested in how kind of setting out a very minimal infrastructure with very limited resources could create actually an immense kind of potential as a space of play, one that's much richer than an environment which has beautiful slides and swings and really allows only one or two kind of ways of experiencing that environment in terms of play. So this is an environment which is constantly being kind of made and remade on a weekly basis, where some of the forms of play are quite risky. They involve the use of tools like drills and saws. And some of the constructions over periods of time can be quite ambitious, but there's an idea as a kind of analog for the city at large that it's kind of constantly being made and remade. There's no sort of ownership or possession of a part of the site just because you built something. You're part of a community of children that use that space and constantly exercise their sort of agency within it by constructing and deconstructing the work of other people. And these kinds of projects really then lead into a kind of larger and more complex project that has really been ongoing now for us for nearly 15 years in an area of Liverpool called Granby, where we began working with a group of residents who had, for want of a better word, I guess, had a number of physical battles with police and the local authorities in the 1980s. It was an area that was kind of characterized by post-industrial decline, but historically one of Liverpool's most diverse communities, reflecting its history as a metropolitan port that at the height of its prowess was a center of trade for all kinds of global networks. But that kind of diversity and the prosperity of this area by the 1980s was really seen as something problematic by the local council amidst a kind of wider culture of police racism and other things. There were a series of quite intense conflicts that led to a policy of moving social rented, basically tenants who are renting from the council to other parts of the city and kind of actively breaking up communities in this area. And over time then that fabric begins to decay because large parts of these streets become depopulated, incidents of arson or in some cases demolition by the council become more common. And so, you can see the kind of quality of the built fabric in the detail of some of these brickwork. They're not low cost kind of generic houses. Actually, the fabric of the buildings themselves is quite special. But the kind of condition of them at this point in time in 2010 when we come in and start working with a group of residents who'd stayed there from the 1980s to 2010 was pretty bad. But in that intervening period, I think, in spite of this kind of quite robust environment, a lot of small-scale and quite domestic actions by those residents had started to change the character of those streets. So digging up kind of pavements, planting, painting the fronts of houses, even where the houses themselves were empty, had been a way of kind of addressing this very harsh, almost kind of militarized condition that you see in many of the houses. And even though the occupancy of those streets at this time is quite low, actually that environment really starts to kind of reflect the fact that it is quite deeply cared for and quite kind of humane. And our role within that really was much less dramatic in some ways than in the previous projects that I've showed. It was about addressing a kind of strange and quite counterproductive tax loophole in the UK where if you're demolishing buildings, you get a tax break. So there are lots of incentives to just clear away buildings and rebuild. And instead work to try and achieve this community's intent of renovating the houses that to them were kind of culturally significant as a kind of emblem of what they'd fought for and really resisted in the face of a desire from the council to demolish and move them on over the previous 30 years. And so the renovation of these buildings in and of themselves is very simple and very low cost. So each house is renovated for around $60,000. You know, some attention to the kind of small bits of joinery and the color schemes, and you know, all these houses are in quite varied condition. So rather than having a sort of set design for each house that we roll out across the street, where a kind of ceiling has come down upstairs, you know, we'll kind of express that. So there's some volumetric differences in the houses resulting from their specific conditions. But more than that, I think there was an interest in how the money that was coming in to renovate these houses could not just improve the physical quality of the buildings, which has been something I've talked about as being quite important in previous projects, but to think about how this is the start of a way of also initiating the kind of economic renewal of the area. So obviously when everybody's moved out, a lot of the businesses collapse and other things. And while we're not going to change all of that overnight, we can think about how an investment of $600,000 in the renovation of 10 houses can, as far as possible, go into local businesses rather than generic contractors. So if we're designing for that, how do we do it? And the main way in which we tried to do it was to say, you know, these extraordinary interiors that would have been built in the early 1900s when labor was cheap and materials were expensive. So materials were often invested with an incredible amount of care and craft. You know, we've got to recreate these interiors at relatively low cost, but how do we do it in a way which isn't generic? And so we took a portion of the budget for each house. It was only 5% of the budget for each house. It's around $3,000. We take that as a starting pot. It's around $30,000 for the 10 houses. And we use it to set up a pilot program to build lots of different artifacts for each of these houses, from these kinds of mantelpieces which gather together basically rubble and demolition waste from all the houses around, and the backyards, to make these kind of ceramic, these concrete mantelpieces at the heart of the home, and also kitchen counters, but also develop a range of ceramics that I'll talk about a bit later on. And so thinking about the ways in which these houses can be kind of designed with these sorts of special elements that are developed in partnership with local people who can start to acquire the skills in these relatively simple fabrication processes, so that future houses renovated in this way also have a small income stream coming from the main construction project. Not as a sort of, you know, instant transformation of the local economy, but as a small way of investing and starting to build a kind of business infrastructure alongside the physical changes taking place. And I think at this point, there is quite a transformation, I guess, in Assemble as well. Like some of those people that had left to kind of go off and develop in their education are sort of coming back into the organization. At the same time, some people are saying they want to sort of more formally leave and aren't going to come back. And so that set of relationships really is starting to change. And, you know, at this point, having been around for a few years, we're also starting to look further into the future than we would have been at the point where we made, you know, just 2 or 3 projects. It's becoming a more serious concern. And a big part of that then is how, as an organization, we start to negotiate kind of uncertainty and change. Now, partly that involves kind of moving through different legal structures. We started off as a community interest company, which is really not a particularly suitable structure for taking on risk and kind of public projects and other things. But it was quite useful and kind of quick to set up when we started in 2010. And that actively supports the establishment of organizations like this one in Granby I'm describing, that can bring together and access funding to support smaller scale, more community-led projects. And yeah, really a kind of part of that workshop process was about using one of these empty houses and the shell as a kind of, you know, site as a workshop in a similar kind of spirit and vein to that cinema project. Produce these mantelpieces. And there's this really emphasis on kind of quite simple processes, like that can be visible and kind of realized on the street itself. So we're not sort of going back to London, prototyping lots of stuff, manufacturing it there, and then shipping it back to Liverpool to install. But kind of how we kind of, as far as possible, situate ourselves in a place for a project and open up, I guess, what are often quite invisible processes of design and production and making and construction as a way of demonstrating like that actually all of these processes that go into transforming an area like this are quite human scale. They're quite relatable, but often processes that people don't necessarily have a lot of access to or excluded from by formal design processes. And over time, that sort of business that began as something kind of working out of a messy kind of semi-derelict interior on very kind of DIY and low-fi processes has started to think more critically about access to tools, how to develop economy and how to grow as a business, investing in infrastructure, working not only with people from that local area that might have some experience of working in ceramics or other practices, but beginning to think also about its relationship to kind of wider post-industrial areas whose economies have, traditional prosperity and economies have also collapsed. In this case, there's huge amounts of kind of cultural knowledge of ceramic production, both for kind of homewares, but also for architectural ceramics in Stoke and in the Midlands area, not far from Liverpool. And so seeing this kind of small business as something that can act as a kind of design research hub in some ways for a kind of much wider kind of ecosystem of ceramic producers. And so that small business, which kind of began making things, in quite crude ways with really techniques like, concrete casting and press molding, things that are no more sophisticated than any of the model making techniques I've seen kind of walking around the school today, evolves into something that using simple tools and kind of quite low-cost tools, like a press mold that costs maybe $5,000, these aren't million-pound pieces of equipment, can start to become something that moves from just producing for a street to being a street-based architectural ceramics business that employs 5 people, permanently changing cast of people that then go on and in their own way set up other businesses. And that business now has a permanent home in one of the buildings on the High Street. This was the Granby Workshop, a kind of factory and sales room, I guess, for the first few years of its life. It's now moving into a larger kind of purpose-built structure on the street. But, there's other kinds of aspects, I guess, to our work that we're interested in. I think one of those things has been about workspace and really thinking about the kind of conditions that we need to work in a way which is like this, which is quite practical and hands-on. And when we make buildings, we are always dependent on these kind of invisible networks, the sand, the cement, the timber, all of these resources that you need to pull together to go into a building, get processed somewhere, are produced somewhere, are kind of fashioned by people who are shaping those materials into more refined and specific things somewhere. And that somewhere used to be often in cities, and increasingly, as there is kind of, particularly in somewhere like London, huge pressure on land values from residential redevelopment, those things are tending to be pushed further and further out and are kind of being lost as part of quite a mixed city economy, urban economy that we think is really quite important, actually. And so as much as we're interested in the production of buildings, we're interested in trying in some way to kind of protect and preserve the space for this kind of production in the city. So in the same way that we learned from those first projects that we could build things ourselves and think about that as a form of agency, we also understood that we could, get hold of land in those early projects for limited amounts of time, and progressively our interest is in getting hold of pieces of that land for longer lengths of time, with an understanding that that really gives us the kind of security to build up these kinds of social infrastructure in a way that isn't constantly threatened by precarity and allows us to invest in them really in the long term. So we share our workspace now with quite a mixed community of people, some of whom work in things like timber, metalwork. We have large amounts of storage, these practical spaces that serve both as places of production, but also quite public spaces where we host exhibitions and parties. And that really is quite core to supporting the work that the core design practice, Assemble Design Limited, does, which in a way is more conventional. That's sort of the work of the architecture practice, so to speak. Dida mentioned an exhibition in Nottingham. This was the exhibition, The Brutalist Playground, where, yeah, I think there are a strong emphasis in our work on the way in which, as opposed to constantly presenting architectural information or sort of thinking about the way that the built environment is made, we're interested in how you have those conversations with a public that isn't often trained to sort of decode the language that we become very familiar with within architecture schools. I'm going to have a little sip of water. So in this case, one of the things that we're very interested in as a practice is children's play, and particularly the idea of risk and kind of responsibility within play environments. Often we have very anodyne, safe environments now that I think are very limiting in terms of their imaginative potential. That was very different in the kind of 50s and 60s. People built these kind of quite sculptural and kind of dramatic, and in some ways, from today's perspective, dangerous playgrounds. And so rather than sort of looking back nostalgically at these places as things that existed in the past that we no longer have access to, we would sort of reconstruct at full scale some of these installations to experience in the gallery in a way that actually allows people to sort of balance that risk. It's a soft, in this case, a soft saucer, but it has a metal handrail. There are still kind of things that ask you that can take a level of physicality in how they're used, and maybe reproduce some of the relations to these things as spatial and kind of physical artifacts. Not only think about how we sort of present the ideas back through the kind of drawings and photographs that exist of these very well-documented spaces. And it's quite wild, as an architectural, installation. It was, a very, I think, interesting way of relating to that subject. And, similarly, we're very interested, I think, in the way in which we can design with an awareness of the skill that is often contained within the trades that we collaborate with whenever we make a building. So as much as I showed that pyramid at the start, where you have the boss at the top and the kind of younger workers at the bottom, that is also how construction sites generally are organized. You have an architect or project manager, who kind of holds a lot of more or less sort of technical knowledge at the top, and actually often the knowledge of people that have years and years of construction experience don't come into that design process in a way which fully utilizes, I think, that knowledge and experience to good effect. And we're interested in the way that on smaller projects we can really kind of break down that design process that follows quite a typical kind of sequence into something where we leave a lot more space for decisions to be made on site. In this case, the way that we can use something like local indigo that we develop an understanding of based from visits to a wider territory, in this case in the project in Japan. As opposed to kind of designing the facade in great detail, we specified the paint, and we specified that a third of the boards should be painted 3 times, a third twice, a third once. So all of these different boards have, there are 3 different kind of depths of color that these boards have. And then there was no drawing sort of prescribing which board goes where. That was just a decision made by the artisans on site, which produces overall, I think, this quite kind of varied effect. And I think there's a sort of political emphasis to that as well. I think it's important so often when you produce a drawing and you give it to somebody and the only agency they have is to execute it either perfectly or imperfectly, you don't utilize the skill that exists within a kind of, an industry in which lots of people are far more capable and knowledgeable about construction than I am. And we're interested in these processes, I guess, in saying, make some decisions on site. Don't just follow these instructions, and in an industry which so often tries to attribute like responsibility and risk onto individual parties. We're quite interested in ways in which you can say, let's share responsibility for the outcome by not over-determining it in the drawings or the information that we produce. And that extended to other parts of this small project, in this case working with a local specialist in earth construction to kind of build this hearth. So again, it wasn't sort of drawn, it was sort of figured out on site with him as a moment of construction collaboration, and then that extends also to the production of these ceramics. The client for this project was a beer producer, and so we took all of their kind of waste, yeast and grain. From that, you can make a kind of yeasty batter that is a very kind of low fire glaze. So you sort of dunk the ceramic pieces in this, what is basically a kind of sourdough mix when the pieces are really hot, and then you dunk them in water, and they kind of create these very kind of richly fired objects. And then, you know, if that's at a very small scale, we're working as an organization now right up to projects that are worth 200 million pounds. So almost like, you know, whatever that is, 1,000 times more value than, or like many, many thousands of times more value than some of those early projects. But where I think there is still a sort of similar interest in how those initial ideas about kind of construction and simplicity and incorporating different forms of knowledge are brought into a project kind of like this. So in this kind of project where we're working in Australia, not somewhere where we are so familiar with the kind of construction culture. You know, and every construction culture is different. Like you visit Britain, people are building housing blocks in a very different way to the way that they're building them here in the US. Like the construction technologies are just, the vernacular in a contemporary construction context is different. And so rather than trying to sort of design in too much detail the building, we produced these very large models. This model would be about the size of this table, which really describes the kind of architectural intent of a series of elements, like a frame and a series of screens that are held by a set of trusses. And then we ship that model to Australia to a contractor who then we want to send us back the details for how to kind of build. And so constantly thinking between that project like the town square that I shared, or a project like this, where we're in that town square project in terms of like, what's the language of design to enable a conversation with the public about the future use of this space and what will and won't work? In a project like this, deciding that large-scale models as opposed to drawings were the most effective way of communicating our intent, but also leaving a lot of ambiguity by making a massive 1:50 model into which the contractor's knowledge could take responsibility for quite a lot of the detailed elements of the design. And I think, yeah, that's something that we're very interested in really in terms of the tools. And at different points as well, like we've also explored the role of building. So we had a building company for a bit called Assemble Builders that really enabled us to start to think about how we took some of that kind of direct interest in construction from those early projects that were very temporary, where we were the client, up to larger scale kind of, you know, structures that were, you know, proper buildings. Partly because we were interested in the economy of construction, like by taking on the role of construction as a young design practice where we didn't have enough design work, we could employ ourselves as builders. Partly because we were interested in the way in which it allowed us to take a different view of regulations in some ways. Partly because so often when you design something really intelligently, you're not the person who benefits. You know, like you don't get paid extra for a really intelligent piece of design. But if you're the builder and you can save lots of money by designing something in a better way, there's a sort of beauty to that that supports what are otherwise quite challenging business models that architecture, I think, generally is afflicted by. So in this case, I think this project kind of combines quite a few ideas, you know, both how we take on a responsibility in the construction, how in the construction of something like this, of this facade, we don't, again, design everything in so much detail as to work with somebody who ultimately is responsible for realizing the facade within a framework that we've set out, like the tile dimension in this case, but also how we take our interest in workspace and these kinds of often hidden types of activity in the city and give it a kind of special front, something that kind of elevates and sort of celebrates these kinds of working activities within an otherwise quite rough and kind of worn urban fabric. Like, how do we make something quite beautiful and specific? And so really, like, as Assemble's practice has kind of evolved, it has evolved into a much more complex organization than just an architecture practice, which is kind of contained within Assemble Design Limited. And what that enables us to do is take on projects of increasing size and complexity. This was our first public project, of which we won through a public competition for the kind of renovation or transformation of a Victorian public baths into a kind of new arts and cultural centre in South London, really kind of carving out within these industrial spaces a new set of very varied types of exhibition condition. So these kind of new conditioned spaces you can see here with the trusses, as well as these kind of found spaces in some ways within the kind of basements where floors are taken out. So again, still quite a minimal. All of our projects are driven by a kind of economy and an interest in reuse and how to sort of make and celebrate, I think, the qualities of existing buildings as far as possible. But even within this kind of project, where in many ways is quite a light touch, and these spaces end up being, on the one hand, very rough, these newer spaces provide the kind of pristine, very conditioned, controlled spaces that contemporary art demands. We make use of the former oil tanks on top of the buildings as these uninsulated and kind of totally unconditioned spaces that are very kind of dark and dramatic for the display of totally other kinds of artwork, and still retain this interest in how to kind of relate a building like this to its public context and the public square. There's an interest in that kind of DIY and hands-on culture from those early projects. And the project I showed just before in terms of like, how do we harness the economy and kind of get the benefit of designing and making at a more public scale. And in this project, at the competition stage, we kind of constructed a large-scale facade mock-up from proprietary, is Hardy board, I think is a product you have in the UK. In the US, just kind of generic agricultural corrugated sheet. We make this mock-up and indicate a couple of ways at which key junctions could be formed with specials, but kind of allow the majority of that construction to be made from the standard panels, the ridge beam, so the part which is usually along the kind of top of the pitch, and then these are the gutter pieces here that become part of this almost kind of classical elevation, and testing the way in which a generic kind of stain could be used to color this facade and elevate something. I think in all our work, we're kind of interested in the way that we can use quite cheap and rough and ready materials and kind of elevate them through a careful assembly, I guess, through composition and fabrication into something that feels more kind of civic and refined. In the end, we kind of built a much larger scale mock-up that demonstrated to the contractor that they could build this facade for around a quarter of what they said, and that was, that like building that model again was, or that kind of full-scale mock-up and the sample was a way of, I guess, communicating the idea in a way that had far more traction and was far more effective, and gave us much more control over the final output than would have been possible were we to be working through kind of conventional plan section axonometrics to kind of communicate the idea, or even smaller scale models. It was necessary to kind of build it at that scale in order to kind of give the client confidence. And often as a young practice, 38 now, was 28 when we were doing this, there's a lot of risk to a client employing a 28-year-old who says this can work when you've got a 50-year-old contract in the room who says it never will. So in some ways, the effort to kind of construct these large-scale mock-ups was just a way of overcoming a sense of kind of certainty that everybody else in the room felt that these things were impractical or not possible. And then, we retain an interest, I guess, in the way in which that transfers to other scales of activity as well. There's a kind of relationship between this reception desk that we make in pink corrugated concrete and the kind of rippled facade of the green sheets. And at the same time, yeah, like more recently, a project we completed in the south of France, again, large-scale transformation and reuse of a train depot. And in this context, I guess starting to think less about the building site itself as the kind of space or kind of envelope in which we're operating, but thinking instead about the wider territory and the environmental impact. And if something like that Granby Workshop project is really about thinking how we can design a building to transform or kind of introduce new opportunities for small-scale production and economic development within a project. This project in the south of France was about understanding how all of the regional resources that were potentially available could be used in a culture of local construction that kind of reorientated much more towards its particular eco-region. And so, on the one hand, that's materials like rice straw, which is typically, after the rice crop is taken away, the straw is typically burned. Huge amounts of sunflowers produced in this region, principally for oil, and then all of the rest of the kind of dried husk of the sunflower is effectively thrown out as waste. Large-scale kind of quarries where lots of very high-grade stone is used, but lots of quarry fines and waste is not. And there's huge amounts of clay produced as a byproduct of sand extraction in this area as well, which again is just sort of deposited and left as a waste material commonly. And so again, this idea of a sort of site as a classroom is really kind of critical to bringing together lots of different parties right from the start. So we're working with an organization called BC Materials to take all these materials from the wider territory and prototype their use in construction through initially small-scale tests, and then starting to move to kind of larger-scale constructions and mock-ups that are investigating how the local straw, not just a generic straw product, can be used, and which businesses we can partner with to kind of process that straw into a usable construction module, how we can use those clays in the production of local plasters, and how we can start to work with local contractors and people that have some knowledge of building in stone or other kind of related trades, and to think about how we start to manufacture, for example, using the stone dust, these kind of large-scale building components in techniques like rammed earth or compressed earth blocks. So we make these kind of larger-scale mock-ups on the site. And then the renovation of that building really as a way of creating an initial demand, or in some ways taking the risk on the initial implementation of these things, not just as ideas, but at scale in a project. So that rice straw used to insulate the shell of this stone building. Local timber isn't often used in construction. Again, we use it here. There's an emphasis on using things like miscanthus and kind of widely available within a wetland environment, which is what the south of France Camargue region is. There's an abundance of reed. We can take that reed and use a local reed to make these kind of mattings that you need to function basically as an expansion control in the wall build-up. So again, taking out a kind of generic material that was sourced, in this case, I think, from Bulgaria, and using a kind of local supply of that material. But again, the processes are very low cost. These aren't expensive materials to produce. This is just kind of simply processed reed using an existing agricultural machine that's then stitched together with, you can just see these threads. Local plasters kind of applied to seal that, and then in a separate space within that building, a kind of much more massive, cool space produced, again, demonstrating experimental principles, so sort of rammed earth up to the first level, then compressed earth blocks above. And you can sort of see the difference in textures here, this kind of coarser, more like granular material, and then the compressed earth blocks above. And then in a third and final space, the local timber, which is not particularly high grade, instead of making it into a more kind of technical timber material, which would require lots of glues, and again, has to go then through a more capitalized factory setup, has to go away from the local area to go through that kind of processing. We just designed with the constraints of the material that was available to make, in the end, what ends up being a much more kind of complex and articulated timber structure made in solid wood. And again, like timber connections, so that can all be deconstructed and kind of put back through saws and kind of reused in future if this building is dismantled. Making use of the available resources on site as well, going back similarly to that kind of Granby principle of in the mantelpieces. We had to insulate the whole roof, take all the tiles off. Tiles that were in too poor a condition to just be cleaned and reinstalled were sliced up and then used to make this quite beautiful decorative lime floor in the kind of main, what they call the agora, so a kind of public space within the building. And then some of them were broken up and kind of used to stipple the facade that is then kind of re-rendered as well. So really sort of changing, creating this kind of much rougher character than the typical way of renovating these buildings, which kind of leaves them quite pristine. But around this point also then, some of these things become less relevant to the core practice. The CIC gets voided a bit in some ways. We sort of spun out most of those projects that the CIC was producing into independent employee-owned businesses, and actually building work turned out to be too risky. And we couldn't scale that building work in a way that meant we weren't just replicating what we'd done before. There was an interest then, I guess, in focusing really on the design and workspace strands of the practice. But yeah, in relation to these other organizations that the CIC had set up, we continue to work and demonstrate these sorts of specialisms. Black Horse Workshop was that public library for making I talked about. Baltic Street was the playground we set up. Granby Workshop, the ceramics manufacturer. And Assemble Play was a sort of spin out of the exhibitions project, which does effectively as a kind of mobile, loose parts play organization that delivers play in public spaces all over London. So there's the relationship really between the formal design practice and all of these other ways in which we think about how we can have an impact on the cultural life, maybe, an economic life in the city in a way that formal building projects can't secure and doesn't enable. I'm going to go through this part sort of fairly quickly because I think it's more, I'm slightly aware of time. But it kind of talks a bit more about the way in which we've kind of changed as an organization. But I sort of wanted to finish really by talking about where we are in terms of our thinking and how much our built education really focused on the idea of architecture as a civic practice, but still one very much focused on the idea of form, that we impact the city through careful consideration of form. And I think the interesting organizations doing work that I think responds to the kind of most difficult issues environmentally and socially and economically of today are more actively engaged in reform, both in terms of the kinds of bigger ecosystems and that kind of water that we exist in as architecture practices to create conditions in which different outcomes are possible. But also, I guess, the reform of the architecture practice as an entity in its own right, which I think is really important and is an incredibly exciting moment to think about. Like, if you grew up in England and graduated into architecture school in the 1950s, 50% of your group would go and work for the state. And today that's less than 1%. So within 30 or 40 years, we've gone from architecture as a public practice to an entirely private practice. And yet we still hope or expect that architecture and in a fully private model can deliver something equivalent to the same kinds of public good that a largely public model of practice delivered half a century ago. And I think that just doesn't work, right? And, I understand that the kind of landscape is different in the US, but I think the same opportunity exists really to just fundamentally question the primacy of private practice as the vehicle through which it's possible to do work that realizes in some ways some kind of public good. And I think the interesting organizations today that are effectively doing that are doing so when they think about practice as part of a network of organizations that act on the built environment in specific and varied ways. In material terms, I think that's, there's an amazing organization in Belgium called BC Architects and Materials, who kind of combine an architectural practice with a business that manufactures clay and earth-based products in central Brussels. So they take, every time a building is built, not every time, but when a building is built in Brussels, they go and take the clay. Brussels is a city kind of built on clay. They take it away to their construction site, they process it in a big shed, and then they manufacture like unfired earth building materials that their architecture practice then demonstrates in their work. And that has now become a kind of major producer of earth products, and their projects give people confidence that those products should be used and can be used in more mainstream ways. And I think that's a really extraordinary example of something which is, actually not that sophisticated. Again, when you look at the equipment that they're using, and I think this is always really important, our interest is in using low-cost kinds of machinery that are not so different to the kinds of things you probably have in this university. If you need to spend 10 or even 100 million pounds on a piece of manufacturing equipment, you can't really afford mistakes. Like, that's why mass manufacture of housing, I think in the US and the UK, has never really got off the page. Where you look at examples from Scandinavia where people built much simpler structures using timber and generally less industrialized forms of technology, were able to build tens and tens of thousands of houses. I think BC is a really interesting example in that kind of context. I think from the perspective of circularity, which people talk about a lot, a woman called Barbara Buser, who sits really at the center of a network of organizations that focus on policy change, that focus on material reclamation and something like Circular Building Hub. So, how do we use at large scale parts of buildings that are being demolished? That's a very hard thing to do if you're an architecture practice. You need to construct a whole, basically, system of organizations that are capable of assessing those materials, licensing those materials, storing those materials, and then installing those materials. And I think, again, Balbur in situ is an organization which is not only kind of looking at the problem and saying it's a problem, but thinks about architecture's role as this kind of unique tool, both for design but also organizing systems in sort of changing and creating the infrastructure needed for that reuse to happen at large scale. And these kind of extraordinary projects that they've realized in Switzerland. I think a very interesting organization called Dark Matter Labs, who are based in the UK, who really are interested in the dark matter, so how the way in which legal and financial and ownership agreements or governance agreements between organizations fundamentally shape how those things are able to be resilient and kind of have integrity. They're less and less, although they started as an organization called Architecture 00, interested in making good buildings and are much more interested in effectively making good briefs. Because so often it's at the brief stage where the imagination and the thinking is too narrow or too insecure to sort of enshrine good public outcomes in design processes. And the boring revolution they talk about. So I think, Assemble's practice really has kind of evolved in these different stages. As we've moved from a very DIY scale of practice, initially with those small projects, which started with the level of experience, that actually is probably less. If you're a graduate student in here, you are more experienced and had more time in education than we did, and have probably been involved, in some projects in your practical life and professional studies so far that are more complex than we had experience of when we started doing those very small scale initiatives. Those things would be very difficult to do in the UK now because the context has changed. Small bits of funding aren't available. The city itself and building is a much more regulated activity even than it was in London 15 years ago. So it's not to say, we did it, why can't everybody else? I think the conditions are really specific. But what it is to say, I think, one of the things which is very rarely kind of critically considered in, as a part of your studies, or very rarely questioned, is just like fundamentally the nature and structure of the organizations that you're going to graduate into and their capacity to support or affect the kinds of outcomes that you want from your work in the world. And architecture practice as it exists has not always been this way. You know, prior to, you know, the kind of industrialization, really, you know, the architect wasn't even really a figure. Well, industrialization, if you go back to the Renaissance, it's kind of invented as a sort of discrete discipline. You know, and it can be reinvented again. And I think the most interesting organizations that are doing the most impactful work are doing that, are kind of thinking less of the architect as a professional practice and more as a kind of broad disciplinary knowledge that equips you to think and act and operate within the whole system of the built environment in a way that is, I think, more collaborative and more capable of drawing on the expertise of lots of others within an increasingly kind of complex field of construction. And that's what I'd really leave you with, I think, is just to sort of think and reflect on not only the kinds of buildings or work that you want to make, which are always the concern of the everyday projects that you're engaged with in studio, but to think about how you might need to organize or who to organize with in order to do that work and to do it effectively. So I am in the process of leaving Assemble because I don't think this way of organizing, which we've spent 15 years putting together, is ever going to be able to move away as we do larger projects within a world in which there is less and less money for public, large-scale public capital projects, where we're not always going to be beholden to those private interests if that's where the money comes from. I can't feel like I can sincerely say, you know, working for public clients, it's really possible to create good public outcomes anymore. And so I've moved from working, I guess, for architecture practice to working for some of those organizations at a community level that are looking to build, but who never have the resources to hire architects. They don't have the resources to pay professional fees, because for an organization to hire you, it usually costs 3 or 4 or 5 times what you actually get paid. So actually, it's quite possible to go and work for them in-house, get paid the same amount, but bring a totally new capacity to organizations that don't typically have access to spatial or design thinking. And for me, that feels like partly an interesting change 15 years into my career, but also a very different place to stand and reflect on the issues and give me a different place to kind of try to leverage maybe some different kinds of outcomes and value in the way that the built environment is made. So, yeah, it's quite a expansive journey through sort of 15 years of practice, and I appreciate I haven't sort of gone into great depth in any of those projects, partly because there's a lot of information online about any of those projects if you choose to find it. Like a lot of articles have been written about projects like the Luma project in the south of France or Granby. They're incredibly well documented. So if you're interested in some of those things and a bit disappointed that I didn't talk about them in more detail, you know, those resources really do exist. But I think this sort of stuff is much less often discussed. And if it felt a bit abstract, then thank you for hanging in there and sort of sharing in that. But yeah, I hopefully also something sort of stimulating or provocative about that in relation to the moment you will find yourselves at in your professional lives and your kind of nascent architectural careers. So yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak. Sorry, I also ran over a bit, so thanks for your patience and
this was a really
time.
inspiring talk. I think this is exactly the kind of talk we wanted to hear. So thank you very much for taking the time. Now, we went a bit over, but I think we have still rooms perhaps for a couple questions if you have a burning desire to ask a question. Okay.
I have loads of questions, but I'll just ask 2. So, it's one. Okay. My question is, you have put a lot of thought into the materiality of it, of all the buildings that you've worked with. My question is, like, when you were working with buildings abroad, how difficult was it to do the material studies? Because you are a community practice, and it's really important that you keep your budget in line, and you also have to travel abroad
Yeah.
and study materials.
Yeah, it's a good question, yeah.
That's something very difficult. And
In a weird way, it's harder to do in the UK because to some extent, I guess, you know, in all of those projects that we're doing abroad, we would kind of go for a period of time, and we do kind of extended residencies. I think one of the things which is really important maybe to say is that, like, I think it's all of this work, I think all of any work really is a product of relationships. Like, good relationships produce, allow you to take risk. That's good client relationships, good relationships with the contractor. And I think really the work of the first bit of Assemble, or up to this point, has always been enabled by quite committed relationships between all the different people involved. That enables a level of risk-taking or openness, or like diversion from the original brief or whatever, within a culture where, you know, as the architect, everybody is basically looking to move blame and to avoid risk. And it's quite, generally speaking, we've also had plenty of those relationships where, you know, it's not collaborative. It's about sort of responsibility passing. And the outcome is almost compromised in those situations, I think. But we found that the only way we could create those kinds of conditions is to go places and spend a lot of time there. You know, like a group of people basically moved to Scotland to do that playground project. You know, the same with the project in Liverpool, the same with the project in France. You know, we were there like every 2 or 3 months, we would go there for a month. And work very closely there. It's a bit different in somewhere like Australia. You know, that's why we kind of took a different technique and just sort of said, we'll do, instead of, you know, it's easy in that situation to say, how do we provide more information because we can't be there? Whereas actually our attitude in those sorts of projects, or in Japan, we did the same thing. It was like, we make a big model and send it. And there's so much not shown in the model that they have to figure that out and propose it and come back. So I think in the context where we can't be as present, we try to do less and make sure we're not, you know, we're just leaving enough space for somebody to come in and take responsibility, and for that responsibility not just hang in the middle. But actually, as we've got older and people have kids, and, you know, also you'll find out that once you get over 32, you do start to get tired more quickly and this kind of stuff. You know, there's some basic things, like how incredible reserves of energy to do these kinds of projects. And we were pretty hardcore in our 20s, you know, just like, because it was really exciting, but we could work all the time. We had a lot of stamina for the work, which we don't have now. Whereas if you're, you know, there's a level of commitment to doing a project abroad that maybe unsurprisingly also, for people to hire someone from the UK is a pain in the, you know, it's a pain in the ass. So they usually, there's a high level of ambition when somebody gets you to go abroad to work with them. But in the UK, often it's just like, you know, the organizations that we might work with now in the UK don't have as much skin in the game, and also it's just too easy. It's harder for us to be as committed to going 2 hours from home. People just want to go home. And yeah, I mean, in a way, it's like there was a level of commitment to those projects, and I think there still is to the overseas ones, because there is a level of commitment on the client side. But I personally have found, as we started doing larger projects, we've just slipped into more conventional ways of working. And those relationships are more conventional, and the expectations are more conventional. And, you know, that's partly the reason for going working with organizations who feel like, you know, they live or die by whether this project happens in the place where they're going to live for the rest of their lives. And there's a totally different intensity to that I really enjoy. Because, yeah, otherwise so often people don't have that much kind of, you know, people making decisions about what gets built aren't the people that are going to live with that outcome, you know, for the next 10, 20, 50, 100 years. But yeah, weirdly, the projects closer to home often don't get as much energy as the ones where it's like when you take it on, you know it's going to be difficult, and so you're really invested. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for presenting your work. I was wondering about when you find a site of interest for, I guess I was interested in like your earlier projects with the theater and the housing as well. Do you survey the community on like what they kind of need, or do you take an approach where you have a vision and you kind of see if it sticks and kind of work from there?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we're always interested in, well, so for those early projects, it was much more like, community is a very abstract word, right? Like, and I think it gets used a lot. Like there is no, even in that first project, the petrol station project, there's a local community of business. There's a community of people who walk past the site every day, like, in both of those cases, I don't think we would particularly sort of survey them and say, like, what do you want to see on this site? I think we're interested in doing things and seeing what the response is. And often, whether it's in the business of like the ceramics business, we don't set up an architectural ceramics manufacturer. We do something small. We see what the reaction is, and then we reflect on that, and then we either develop it more or we change it. And that's the same across every single thing that we try to do as a principle. Is like, if there's one lesson from modernism that I think I feel like I take in my practice, it's like, if you make big moves and you get it wrong, then it takes a lot of time and a lot of money to undo the big move. And in a way, what's interesting about working in these contexts of like more Victorian streets and other things, or like having never had the resources to make big moves for the first 10 years of our practice, we would always have to do something small. Necessarily then would then be a pause, and we would get, I wouldn't say feedback or consultation, we have a relationship with people in the places that we're working who say, why did you do that? Or like, it's interesting that you did that. I wouldn't have thought like that this would work, but actually it did. I was worried that a bunch of like, troublesome youths would come if you put that thing there, and this would become a crime hotspot. I wanted more security, but actually you built that thing, and that didn't happen. And that's not what I would have imagined. And I think there's a sort of, it's the same reason why I talk a few times about like, these are cheap tools that we buy. We're not interested, like if you spend £10 million, you're out of business immediately if your £10 million bet doesn't work. If you buy one tool and it costs a few £1,000s, you can afford for that mistake to happen, and you can adjust, and I think there's a kind of principle of trying to do small things and see what the outcome is, and to use those things as a way of, I guess, fragmenting a process. Like, people don't understand drawings, and too much of the way that the built environment is made now is about making massive speculations based on unreasonable levels of confidence in what's going to happen once you've built something. And so if you can build something small, and you can't do that for everything, but you can do it for a lot of things that don't require you to be as deterministic at the beginning of a process. But that's what a lot of the way that the built environment produces is like now. So yeah, I think that's, but I think that's different. I think we don't really survey people, we speak to them. And we don't really consult them. I guess we try to find ways of spending as much time having informal conversations with people about the situation as we do having formal meetings about drawings and proposals and other things. And yeah, that's, in all of those things, I think we try to be critical about like, what it's really my responsibility to decide as the architect. Like, what do I know best about a place and the impact that a decision might have? And actually, what has my education given me a false sense of confidence that I know best about? That actually somebody who has lived there for 30 years or has a different experience to me might know. And like that feels maybe more important than, yeah, the tools of kind of engagement or consultation or these things, which I think often are about just validating a set of ideas that you might already have. And I think that's quite an important distinction or tension in the work, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I think in the interest of time, we have to draw it to a close, but if you're welcome to approach James at the end. But thank you so much. This was extremely inspiring, I think, for our students to talk about not just your work, but really how you practice. And I think that was really, really inspiring for our students, I hope. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Oh, there are more. There are more. There we go. This is my last slide. Yeah, no, it should have been 2 hours more. Well, yeah. No, I can trim it next time. Anyway, thank you very much.